The State Department gave a heads up to travelers going into Mexico. Reynosa, Matamoros, Nuevo Laredo, trouble spot. Violence could break out, roadblocks, and yes, Americans are the targets of carjackings and kidnappings, and nothing new to us. It's just we've seen a flare-up of this violence yet again, close to us. We've talked about security, border security issues before with our Brownsville Congressman Filemon Vela. We welcome him back to the show. What's the latest that you're hearing from colleagues from across the border?
2 weeks ago, the mayor of Brownsville and I met with the interim ambassador to Mexico and officials from the White House, so that we could address some of the issues that we're experiencing in Reynosa and Matamoros. Essentially, I think we're kind of at the point where we really need to use our diplomatic efforts to get Mexico to do on the Tamaulipas border what they did in Ciudad Juarez back in 2010.
Please explain, what did they do over there?
Back then, Ciudad Juarez experienced about 3,000 murders per year. It's down to about 400 to 500. A member of Congress from El Paso tells me that people are repatriating from El Paso back to Ciudad Juarez. It's not perfect, but back then they committed about 10,000 federal troops and 3,000 federal law enforcement officials into Ciudad Juarez.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's different dynamics because of the logistics. Ciudad Juarez is one large city, and the logistically, Reynosa and Matamoros, Rio Bravo corridor is more spread out. So.
Yeah, and on top of that, the violence is not limited to just Matamoros. It's Reynosa. It's points west, even over closer to Monterrey, Nuevo León State. They're battling cop kidnappings and things like that. It's just a vast area for them to patrol.
It's gotten pretty grim, and it's gotten a little bit more complicated even since we had those meetings. The Mexican government had issues in Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas, Michoacán, and of course here in Tamaulipas. And then here in the last, they've had some very serious issues arise in Guadalajara, which was, not something that we had expected. So they've got quite a challenge on their hands, and all we can do is keep pushing. I think that in addition to the security issues and to the security efforts that need to be made, in the wake of the 43 students that were killed in Guerrero, President Peña Nieto announced the establishment of secure economic zones in 3 areas of Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. And one of the things that we're trying to do is see if we can't get the Mexican government to start thinking in those terms here on our border.
You'll have to explain secure economic zones and what he's doing down there a bit more. Joining us on 710 KURV is Brownsville Congressman Filemon Vela.
Congressman Tim Sullivan here. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Tim.
So what we're talking about here would require quite a military operation on the part of the Mexican government. And President Calderon would probably have been amenable to that. Are you hearing anything from President Peña Nieto that he would be willing to ramp up the military in Tamaulipas?
We haven't heard anything specifically. I can tell you it's a long process. It's going to take some time. But I can tell you that the feeling that we got in our conversations with the Mexican ambassador and with our meetings at the White House with the president and vice president, leading officials on the Western Hemisphere, there are serious discussions going on with respect to attempting to do something about what's going on in Tamaulipas.
What's your assessment of how Mexico is controlling its southern border as far as the immigration aspect, to holding back Central American immigrants who may be trying to do the same thing they did last summer about this time?
Well, what we've heard on that front is that those efforts have been relatively successful. I am hearing that although our border enforcement officials are seeing some evidence of families still coming across, it's nowhere near to the extent that we saw during last year's crisis.
These security economic zones that you were referring to right before I pitched it to Tim.
Very generally, the approach would be to help some of the local companies promote economic development. At the same time, there were some programs that were dedicated to making sure that the youth in those particular Mexican communities, would begin to choose the right path So it's a
Yeah, the
socioeconomic
potential foot
restriction.
soldiers. Yeah, you're right. The potential foot soldiers for the cartels. Well, back to us. It sounds to me that that's more of an economic development type of enforcement. Back to the security issue, the lack of rule of law close to the border with us, with many Americans by the thousands on a day-to-day basis traversing into Mexico because they have to. Some of them work at Maquilas. They work in manufacturing close to us or maybe in Monterrey. And now with the State Department saying that some of these folks seem to be targets of violence, either because of family issues or business, we have to go into Mexico. Should the U.S. government, should the White House, should our ambassador to Mexico City be pressing Mexico City harder to protect American lives that need to travel into Mexico more often?
Well, I'll answer that very specifically because I spoke to our ambassador in Mexico about 3 weeks ago and have been engaged with him regularly throughout this process. I think that he is doing everything he can in that regard, and I think he fully understands the dangers that are involved. But I think you also raise a very good point that a lot of times we forget about, and that is that there are approximately 150 to 170 maquilas in Matamoros, about 250 in Reynosa. My estimates are that there are about 8,000 to 10,000 Americans that live here in the valley.
That's part of the morning commute. Yes, sir.
Crossed over to work.
I mean, the U.S. government gives billions of dollars to Mexico to try to secure its country. You think that they would focus and pay back the favor a bit more on the border, where American taxpayers are actually having to go to work. And there, Congressman, we got to go. We'll keep in touch. Congressman Filemon Vela from Brownsville joining us on 710 KURV.